should you be able to ban people from a system like Twitter, which is supposedly set up for conversation and has increasingly had to find ways to manage and moderate those conversations in ways that have been troubling to people who advocate for a kind of free speech absolutism.
You know, we have a neighbor here in the Austin area who has some views on that, and he took those views to the point of buying Twitter. And that has created a lot of uproar online, and, you know, in fact, in all communities, just because a lot of, you know, not just personal communication, but business communication happens on Twitter now. And having someone who has a whole different approach take over and be, you know, the god of Twitter is frightening a lot of people. This time on the Plutopia podcast, Jon and Scoop do a deep dive into the land of free speech, which is what this country is supposed to be. But is it, Jon?
I don't know. Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of the Plutopia podcast. And Scoop and I are going to talk about whether we have free speech or not, and just kind of what's going on with that. Because everybody seems to be freaking out about it right now. This whole question of whether we have free speech, whether we should have free speech, whether speech should be moderated, et cetera, et cetera. I think, no, go ahead.
What's the going price of free speech? Because it doesn't seem to be free anymore. It seems to be expensive speech.
Yeah. Well, this sort of all goes back to the advent of what we refer to as user-generated content, or UGC, in media. It used to be that when you talked about media, you were talking about a relatively finite number of channels that people could access to get information via news or other sources. Content was fairly limited and it was heavily vetted. And then the internet came around. And this user-generated content thing was an inherent aspect of the internet from early on. Early on, people found that they could broadly share content. We talk about how in the broadcast world, content was one to many. And going from one to many, you could definitely put walls between the one and the many. You could put filters between the one and the many is what I really should say. You could have ways to conform that content to standards and practices and biases and whatever. Many to many, it gets more complicated. As we found that all people coming online could potentially become publishers, even if it's in a small way over some social media site or whatever. The sense is that people are starting to think of themselves not just as content consumers, but as content creators and content publishers. And much of the content that we have today is from organizations that claim to present news. So what is news? The definition of news that you find in the dictionary, or I found in one dictionary, was newly received or noteworthy information, especially about recent or important events. There's nothing about that that says that it's true or that you're getting the actual facts. You're getting information, and information could be true information or false information. News does not equal truth. So there used to be something that we call journalistic objectivity, kind of an ideal that professional journalists would aspire to, and that they would learn. I mean, if you became a professional journalist, you would go through a journalism school and you would learn journalistic standards and ethics. And part of that was about trying to learn to objectively present facts without making too many interpretations or stating opinions, so that the reader could make their own assessment of what those facts really mean. Journalistic objectivity started crumbling a bit actually before the internet came around. There was a realization, and they talk about like new journalism or gonzo journalism of Hunter Thompson, where they realized that the person who is actually creating or writing a news story has a perspective that it's hard to divorce from the story itself. So we started getting more comfortable with the idea that journalists would inject themselves into their presentation of news content. It actually became kind of a cool thing to do. Some of the coolest journalists around were people, Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson and people like that, where they were kind of part of the story that they were telling.
Yeah, that period was when I got started in journalism. And to add to your perspective there, the whole thing of the journalist, being trained and learning the ethics, that was all well and good. But when you got into the actual business of communications, radio, television, newspapers, there was a different perspective that they really didn't want you to go on about your ethics and your values, because there was one reason these outlets were in existence, and that was to make money. So that was the real editorial decision that went on. No matter how good the journalist might be, there was someone above them that was making journalistic decisions that had nothing to do with ethics or fairness or truth. It had more to do with commerce. And that's what I encountered, because I came in with all these, pie in the sky, by and by, beliefs about what's good and what's fair, and I was immediately told, you leave that out of our newscast, because we don't want to worry anyone. This is the the mid '60s, and that sort of thing was rampant throughout communications, and it took that whole gonzo journalism development to kind of shake that up. It gave people a reason to really try and tell the truth, and it had some downsides too. There were a lot of people who just liked to make it up, and so we saw plenty of that. Hunter Thompson, took a little freedom with the facts sometimes, but it was in the in the quest for making a funny and engaging article.
Indeed. So what happened in the 90s is that the internet started to facilitate the creation of many channels for distributing information. And it was a gradual process through the 90s as the internet mainstreamed. At the time I came to the internet, it had been a research and development network and a network for technical people. Access was very limited. And some people who were less technical were finding their way onto the internet through various avenues. In my case, it was an online community called The Well, or the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which connected to the internet not long after I started posting on The Well, or I became a member there. It was what they often refer to as a BBS or bulletin board system. So there was a lot of conversation going on there, and it was kind of a preview of kind of what conversations could be like online, where somebody would post something and then asynchronously somebody would come in, like later and read what was posted and add something to that, or make a response, so that a sort of conversational stream of posts would appear where people were having a conversation, but it's not like you're sitting there in real time having a conversation with somebody across the table. There's people coming in as they find time to log into the system and posting information, posting opinions, posting whatever. the internet had more and more of that kind of stuff going on. There was something called Usenet, which was a bunch of what they called news groups. And those news groups were really just places where people could go and read what other people were saying and make responses. So you had the same kind of conversational streams starting to appear there in a big way. Lots of people in there having conversations and posting stuff. And in, I'd say, the mid 90s, we realized that you could actually create content sites online that would be sort of like online magazines. And a bunch of those things appeared in the 90s, and they were like publishing content. And one of the innovations that came from within that kind of online publishing that was happening was the idea of personal publishing. It emerged from systems that they started building to make it easy to manage content online. They realized that you could build a technical facility where you could build a kind of like shell of your online magazine and plug content into that. And that would be a really easy and efficient way to do it. They call that a content management system. And the content management systems that originated in bigger online, like well-funded online organizations for publishing, at the time the internet went through what we called the dot-com bust, where it appeared that the value wasn't there to support a lot of the money that was flowing into these sites and so forth. A lot of them actually went away because they couldn't get additional funding. They couldn't figure out a good funding model. And there was a period around 2000 when the money part of the internet sort of fell apart, and a lot of people were out of work that had been working at these companies. And some subset of those people started thinking about taking this idea of the content management system and creating a smaller scale personal version of it. So you had something like Blogger, which was a site you could go to and create what they called a blog or a weblog and publish to that through a content management system that they had created. And I don't know, other systems appear, WordPress, et cetera. There were various systems that appeared that allowed ordinary people, you know, like you and me. Well, actually, I was a writer and you were also a writer, but people who were not necessarily even professional writers or publishers or anything like that could start a blog. Maybe somebody who had some expertise about something wanted to post more and more about it. There was a lot of that stuff going on, and blog communities would form. People started cross-posting. And that was the thing that sort of led into the creation of this concept of user-generated content.
And that was just a great thing, in my opinion, or at the time, of having the ability to do these things that didn't require you to be a multi-million-dollar corporation. That's what it required in the old days. You had to have a big company behind you that had lots of money that could, purchase the tools of communication. And we were able to get hold of the tools of communication and create all this content without all of that. And that was a big change for me. I was able to go online with the radio stations, do internet radio. That was impossible until some people developed some great tools like, Real Audio came about first, and I played with that. But then they started developing all sorts of means of personal communication that can be spread to the masses. And you don't have to be, a network news person. You can be any person, which also has a bad aspect, because that means the Alex Jones of the world can also get out there and create content, very dangerous and very harmful content. And it's only now that some of those people are being made to pay for their crimes, such as Alex, who is currently being sued by a lot of people and is losing a lot of court cases. But that's kind of the new media environment we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, you have people exposed to all kinds of content from all kinds of perspectives, much of it not really vetted, much of it not coming from professional sources or sources where standards and ethics apply. And that's problematic. And it also creates a situation where the mind share that used to like maybe be devoted to like reading the daily newspaper or whatever, more and more people are spending more and more time consuming information, but they're getting it from all over the place. And the more traditional, like, as I say, carefully vetted and fact-checked sources of information are not the only ones. And they're not necessarily the ones that are getting most of the mind share. People are paying a lot of attention to stuff that they just resonate with, oh, that seems right to me, So that creates an interesting problem of a kind of cacophony and chaos of information flows. Now, it could be that back in the day when we just had a limited number of networks and news sources, it could be that there were a very constrained set of biases that fed into news, political and otherwise biases. Now you have a lot of biases all over the map, and you have a great division of thinking and opinion among people. So it's actually creating a lot of contention. And a lot of this was amplified. This problem was amplified during the pandemic, when there were differences of opinion about public health and public health measures. And we all sort of know what happened there. But that's also, as politics has started overheating and as public health, became contentious, we also had this question of whether people should be able to just post whatever they want to post in an environment like Twitter or Facebook, where there is the possibility of broad exposure of something that's posted. And those things could also be leveraged and manipulated by people who spread propaganda for whatever reason. People could be potentially manipulated through those information flows. And that creates the question of whether some speech is so problematic that it should be precluded from the conversation. And that's when we get to this question of content moderation, which is a very complicated thing. This question about are there things that are off limits? Are there things that people shouldn't be able to publish? Should you be able to ban people from a system like Twitter, which is supposedly set up for conversation and has increasingly had to find ways to manage and moderate those conversations in ways that have been troubling to people who advocate for a kind of free speech absolutism.
We have a neighbor here in the Austin area who has some views on that, and he took those views to the point of buying Twitter. And that has created a lot of uproar online and, in fact, in all communities, just because a lot of, not just personal communication, but business communication happens on Twitter now. And having someone who has a whole different approach take over and be, the god of Twitter is frightening a lot of people. But, when we talked about, free speech being our subject, what came to my mind was the old free speech movement that happened in Berkeley. That's when I first became aware that there was such a thing as free speech. I was a high school kid in West Texas, and heard about all of this stuff, and it, became a really big deal, especially in Berkeley, where they had the strikes and the free speech movement demonstrations getting out of hand, and a lot of uproar there. And I didn't understand what was going on until I got to talking to other people who said, well, we're supposed to have the right to free speech, but we really don't, because when I was in college, you were supposed to have the right to free speech, but you really weren't allowed to exercise it in college, because they had people who said, no, that's inappropriate, and you had a lot of censorship going on, either in the student newspapers, student radio and TV projects were heavily censored. And that was, common throughout, the culture in the early 60s, well, for a long time, but especially in the early 60s when it became a point of protest. And that's when I became aware of free speech. But we're seeing a lot of speech that's going on now that's not so free. If you express support for a particular cause or a particular kind of person, you can really get into trouble. Just ask the Walt Disney Company.
There's this concept of cancellation.
Yeah.
The idea that you can be canceled, and supposedly there's a left-wing cancel culture, but it's not exactly a culture, and it's not a new thing, and it's not on the left. There's a way. I mean, the right wing is like banning books from libraries.
Yeah,
so
well, this whole
exactly
thing,
a left-wing thing.
This whole thing with the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is the operational arm of Disney World in Florida, they have basically said we're going to shut you down without having thought about the consequences, because shutting down that improvement district, which provides the security, the infrastructure, water, power, whatever, and they repair the roads in that area. And by them going into the legislature and passing a law outlawing that improvement district, it's going to cost about $1 billion to those local taxpayers who thought they were doing some free speech stuff. And, that's kind of intrusion upon a person or a company's free speech can be have unexpected consequences, and we're only beginning to see that whole thing play out.
Yeah, I think we should talk about the First Amendment a little bit. The First Amendment prevents the government from making laws that regulate various things: establishment of religion, the free exercise of religion. The government cannot abridge the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. These are all things that pertain to the government and what it can or can't do. And people are raising the First Amendment in these discussions about Twitter. It doesn't apply to Twitter because Twitter is not the government. And so people will say, well, the government should run Twitter. No, the government shouldn't run Twitter. The government could start its own thing, if it wanted to, but there'd be all kinds of tearing of hair and gnashing of teeth about that too. So Twitter is a private company, and Twitter is actually, they've been probably more transparent than Facebook, at least, about how they moderate and so forth. But they have done some things that have set people off, where they said, I'm not getting my First Amendment protection here. Well, forget the First Amendment. That doesn't apply to private companies. It doesn't apply to anything but the government. It's strictly about what the government can or cannot do. And then there's another thing that's in the law, which is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's the only part of the Communications Decency Act that actually didn't get struck down because the act, it was mostly found unconstitutional because of free speech. I mean, the Communications Decency Act was going to say that you couldn't say anything, you couldn't publish anything online unless it was decent. Well, who says what's decent, right? So the Supreme Court trashed that part of that act, but Section 230 persisted because Section 230 was actually set up as a very logical and rational provision of immunity for platforms with respect to all this third-party content that they would potentially be hosting. And it said that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. And what that basically says is it's the person who puts the information out there that is accountable and responsible for it. So you can't sue Twitter because you feel that some member of Twitter defamed you in a post. That responsibility is the responsibility of the member of Twitter that made the post and not of Twitter. And it's really the only way that user-generated content could proliferate to the extent that it has. And there have been some really sort of odd arguments, people who say that we need to repeal Section 230 in order to support free speech. It would have the opposite effect. If you repealed Section 230, then it would be unsafe for a platform like Facebook and Twitter to allow people to post just whatever they want to. It would have to be heavily vetted, and it might force them to just use a stable of content providers that they could manage and vet on their own. User-generated content might just go away.
And there are a lot of companies that would just love to, or not companies, but people that would love to see that go away. Having those, people just speaking up and saying whatever they feel like. And, the whole, Section 230 is constantly being assaulted or talked about by people who really don't like having all that free speech going on. And that's, people keep saying, oh, well, it's safe for right now, but it's never really safe because we used to have something called the fairness doctrine in radio and television. And that was how you gave people the ability to have an even balance, especially in political things. If you had a political comment by one office holder, their opposing, their opponent in an election has the ability to go in and get the same amount of time, and they watered that down pretty quickly because it became a burden to the broadcasters. They didn't want it, and the incumbents in offices really didn't want to give the other person a fair shot.
Well, yeah, and you never could have had Fox News or Rush Limbaugh or any of those things if that was still the case. That's exactly how all those things came to be, was that the fairness doctrine went away and they could say whatever they wanted to politically without having to present an alternative view.
And that sounds really good to people who like to have opinions and they want to get them out there, but there's no until recently there was really no penalty for doing that sort of thing. Now that Alex Jones is being called to account of the things that he put out there, especially with the Newtown massacre. That is perhaps, I would hope, giving these people who just love to just throw out falsehoods, just make it up as on the fly, give them a little pause and think, well, there's a consequence to getting that false information out there.
Right. So I would just mention that Donald Trump was really one of the sources of this concern about Section 230. But the reason that Donald Trump wanted to repeal it or modify it, do whatever to it, was that he wanted to be able to sue Twitter and Facebook for things that people on those systems were saying about him. And he really, because he's not really that smart, was unable to think through what the implications would be for him, because that would hasten the canceling of any accounts he might have on any of those systems, Anyway, so there's all of that stuff. And this is all kind of a setup for talking about Elon Musk buying Twitter and talking about toning down the moderation that Twitter does, which has evolved over the years since Twitter. Twitter was founded in 2007. So it's been with us for, 15 years. And over that 15-year period, the system has become more and more sophisticated, especially in how content moderation is handled. And at some point, they created a set of rules, so the rules are supposedly clear. There's a set of rules on Twitter that you can read. I don't have them right in front of me, but they basically govern what you can or can't post. And one of the issues that they had was people posting sort of high profile misinformation that tended to create a problem, a sort of cognitive problem within the populace, I guess. I mean, the idea was you can't just go on to Twitter and start posting weird public health messaging that claims, I don't know, some kind of medical cure for COVID. Basically spreading misinformation about a pandemic, which is an emergency during the emergency. So that's one thing. They started managing those kinds of posts and banning accounts and that sort of thing. And then I think the thing that got Donald Trump banned from Twitter was what we call the big lie, where he kept trying to say that he had actually won the election when he clearly had not. And that kind of misinformation has a real power and a real force. And Twitter was acknowledging that, and they were sort of trying to do their best. And Facebook was also taking steps. They were trying to kind of suppress things that would tend to create real problems in the real world. So it just happens that because, well, for whatever reason, in my opinion, I think on the supposed right wing, I don't even know if it's a right wing anymore. It's just like a bunch of people have gone a little nuts and they started posting really crazy things. And when they're banned or when those things are removed or whatever, they say, well, conservatives are being, there's a prejudice against conservatives. They're removing their content. Well, no, it has nothing to do with conservatives. It's crazy. They're removing crazy, right?
Well, the guy that does the MyPillow company, and he was a big supporter of Trump and a big spreader of the big lie. And even today on his commercials you see on television, he starts it out by saying, well, the mass media and politicians have canceled us, but we're back, and you can help us fight this cancellation by buying our pillow. It's like, okay, whatever. But the big lie is, it is a useful tool to people who want to, do nasty things. The old saying was, if you tell the lie often enough, it becomes the, in quotes, truth to some people anyway. So it's really hard to fight that sort of thing when they have a lot of people spreading the big lie over and over, and when you have the Tucker Carlsons who really amplify it because they have a huge audience.
Yeah, and we used to say that the way to deal with bad speech is with more speech. You just contradict it. You make the argument, but at some point, it's a force that really can't be handled that way. So there's definitely a need for content moderation.
Well,
it's essential.
People want to do artificial intelligence programming to take care of some of that, and I have some doubts on that because I've seen some of the AI stuff that's been created seems to be pretty good, and there's some that seems to be pretty bad. An example impacted one of our YouTube broadcasts a couple of weeks ago. We did one, and I started it with a clip from a U.S. government civil defense film that told people how to avoid radiation poisoning after an atomic bomb attack by going to your fallout shelter in your community. And it was distributed by the government back in the 50s. And we got dinged by YouTube. They wouldn't put it up with that content on it because they said it would have to be monetized. Otherwise, they couldn't put it up. And they cited a rap group that had used that same government film soundtrack in one of their songs. And they claimed copyright. And so I'm like, oh God.
What?
Yeah, exactly. So it saw it. It said, well, these people have a copyrighted song up, so you can't use it unless you monetize. So I just said, screw it, monetize. So it didn't seem to have that much impact. But that's an example of the screwy things that this kind of programming can do. It may be a little too good.
Yeah, I mean, there was the recent Plutopia Live that we did where I called it The Wages of Fear, where we were going to talk about sort of how fear is proliferating and how people are starting to use fear as a cudgel sort of thing, kind of blunt instrument. Anyway, for that event, I created a Facebook event announcement, and I used a poster from a piece of a poster from an old movie called The Wages of Fear that has a picture of Yves Montand on it with a cigarette dangling out of his mouth. And
oh no,
and
you are promoting smoking, John. Shame on you.
Well, that's it. I boosted that post, and the ad police suppressed the post because of their anti-tobacco stance, I guess.
Up against the wall, Lebkowski, you promoted smoking.
But I appealed it, and they let it through. So at least they had a way around it, and that's the thing with AI. I mean, at scale, at the kind of scale we're talking about, if you have like thousands or millions or billions of users on a system, you can't really police it effectively with human beings as a first line. But you need to be able to use human beings as a second line, and there should be a reasonable appeals process. The other thing is that to the extent you do use human beings, it's hard to get human beings with the degree of judgment and sophistication, at scale, to be able to assess those things. So it's really a problem. It's definitely a problem. And there's also a distinction to be made. My friend Jim Rutt recently wrote a piece about this Elon Musk thing and the question of content moderation and so forth. And he was pointing out that there's different kinds of moderation. One kind is where you moderate for decorum. In other words, behavior. If people are behaving a certain way, i.e., if they're making personal attacks or harassing people or making threats, death threats, bullying, and all that, that falls under decorum, and that's something that absolutely should be managed. You definitely don't want to allow people to become violent in a social media system. But
how about if you want to call Donald Trump how about if you want to call Donald Trump a poophead? Now,
I would let that pass. Okay. But the real question is, to what extent should you be moderating content versus decorum? And content probably gets more slack, So exactly what kind of content would fall under the kind of fire in a crowded theater conception where it's really, truly dangerous content. Is content ever truly dangerous? It's a big question, you know.
The content that was dangerous to democracy was all of this stuff being pushed out about, the big lie, how Trump won, and that all these phony ballots were being counted, and there was all sorts of election misconduct. Just strange stuff that that's dangerous to democracy and to people who don't want to have a Trump presidency. So
but it's sort of like there's people who don't want to have a Biden presidency, and there's you don't make a decision based on your political preference, but you should really make it on the question of whether there's an actual danger or a really egregious problem that could be associated with the particular content. And as you say, with the big lie, it's basically a challenge to democracy. And some people are comfortable with that. I mean, we have a whole set of people in this country who feel that we'd be better off if we weren't a democracy. And there's a lot that they would do to get us where they think we need to be. And that's what's happening there. So if I say the big lie is dangerous to democracy, therefore it's dangerous overall or a bad thing, they might say, well, no, it's not dangerous or a bad thing at all because democracy sucks. We really shouldn't have a democracy. So how are you going to deal with that,
Yeah, it's a real problem, to have beliefs and to express the beliefs and not be attacked these days. The religious right, the ultra-conservative Christian conservatives are becoming, actually militant. And, we have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who came out and said that Satan's controlling the Catholic Church. And it's like, okay, where does this come from? And it's basically just, if you don't agree with her beliefs, then you're a Satanist.
Oh, there was a better thing. I wonder if I can find this. Oh, yeah. So this was Roger Stone. I started to call him Roger Trump. Roger Stone was posting that there's a satanic portal above the White House. It's like a swirling cauldron. It doesn't move day or night. So if you go to the White House and you look up, you're going to see this satanic portal there. He claimed to have photographic proof of this satanic portal. Okay. Wow. I don't know about
I'm speechless
that.
Now. What did he hire, like Stephen King as a writer? I mean, to come up with these things. That's more at home in a King novel.
Well, exactly. But people believe him.
Yeah, well, people believe that a lot of the things that they see in the movies are for real,
I mean, maybe they believe him. Maybe they don't really believe him. You can assume that people believe these things that they're being told or that they're saying, and maybe they don't. I remember some years ago, a cousin of mine who was, pretty far to the right. He'd been a Republican all his life. And I sort of started getting these emails from him that he would send to his Republican friends. And they would have just really wild claims in them. And there was one, I can't remember exactly what it said, but he sent me one thing one time where it was just, crazy. And I said, well, you realize that's crazy, don't you? I mean, that's not real. That's not true. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I know it. We just send these things back and forth, for fun. Mm-hmm. So actually it's sort of like sport for some people.
Yeah,
to make these claims.
Yeah, misinformation as a sport. That's lying for sport.
The claim you're making, as crazy as it may be, sort of aligns with a particular perspective that you have. If you're if you lean pretty far to the right, you might want to own the libs and make fun of them and so forth, and throw out all these kind of wild and crazy ideas to your friends so that you can all have a good laugh. But it's wild and it's crazy. And the real problem is some people start to believe it. So, for instance, when somebody says there's a bunch of pedophiles meeting in a basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., guy shows up with a gun, ready to take them out. It's very sincere. He sincerely believed what he was hearing.
Yeah, people want to go out and kidnap a governor, at the gunpoint just because Donald Trump said they were bad. And that sort of thing is just scary when you are allowed and to be in public and demonizing people and basically saying, go get them. Because there was a lot of that going on January 6th.
But you saw what happened ultimately with that was that those guys who were talking about kidnapping the governor but never actually did anything about it, they never quite got there. They sounded pretty serious, right? But they got off the hook, and they got off the hook because they had been talking about it. They didn't do anything. And that was actually a free speech decision. It said, it's okay for somebody to talk about kidnapping somebody. There was a guy one time who he had written this sort of detailed plan for abducting a girl and raping her. And somebody turned that in, and he got arrested. And he got off because it's really not against the law to think about or talk about or even write about kidnapping somebody and raping them or murdering somebody or any of those things. What's against the law is actually taking the action. So there is a real question there about how bad must speech be in order to be within the purview of the law, where you could actually take action. And those particular guys, I can't remember the name of those guys in that Michigan kidnapping case, but they didn't move far enough in the direction of actually doing what they were talking about doing for the courts to consider it a crime.
Yeah, it's still scary, though, that,
it's scary.
These people walk among us.
I mean, it makes sense to say, everybody has thoughts that are terrible at one time or another. People will think about, man, I'd like to kill that guy. But you don't seriously, say that to yourself. You're just kind of like mouthing off or blowing off steam. And you don't want to get arrested because you said, hey, man, I could almost kill that guy. On the other hand, some people are very methodically working along to try to take some action that would result in somebody's death or torture or whatever. They plan all that stuff. And does this say that if you find somebody planning to do something like that, there's no action you can take? It's a good question, It's like, well, they only talked about it. What can we do?
There have been some problems. I remember when the underground press was still a thing back in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of people that were writing things, against the war in Vietnam, against the Nixon administration, were visited by law enforcement and encouraged to no longer say those sort of things. And, people would say, well, there's a freedom of the press. And they were basically told, not for you because you're not a real newspaper. And we saw a lot of that. And there are still people around that really don't want a freedom of the press to tell the truth because, the truth can be uncomfortable if it's a truth about something bad that you've done.
Yeah. So it's like we have wicked problems here, problems that are difficult to solve. And Elon Musk, there's debate about his actual intentions, but if his intention is truly to create a kind of free speech paradise at Twitter, he's going to have challenges that are beyond the challenges he's had to meet before. I mean, it's one thing to figure out how to build and sell an electric car, but it's another thing to figure out how to manage conversations on the scale of Twitter.
Yeah, he got all upset because he was dinged by Twitter because he posted that he was going to sell some stock and take Tesla private. And that didn't happen, of course. And he got into trouble with the SEC over that. He got into trouble with Twitter, and he just felt he was unfairly treated. I was just telling a little business lie.
Yeah, he likes to mouth off. Well, some people don't realize their own strength, right? Their own power. And, he is supposedly the richest guy in the world. Not quite sure how he got there, but he is in a position of obvious and inherent power. And there's a question about whether he has the right level of responsibility and accountability to go with that power.
Well, there are a lot of people that just say, well, he's a big successful businessman. He must know what's up, so let's trust him because he made a lot of money and he's rich. And there are a lot of people that find that's all the credentials you need.
They said that about Donald Trump, too.
Yes, he was a great businessman. He had all those successful companies that went into the toilet.
Oh. All right, well, I think we're probably at a point where we can wrap.
Yeah.
Because I don't have any solutions for any of this stuff, but I think we've raised some interesting questions.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has a solution as such. There are many potential solutions, but getting them done is a whole different thing. Maybe we'll try to find out who has the solution someday.
Absolutely. I'm hoping for that, and I just hope that our free speech rights persist, especially for Plutopia News Network, where we love to blather.
Yeah, blather is my middle name, our middle name. Well, John, that was very informative, and we shall do this again next week in some form. We'll have some guests coming up, and when we don't have guests, we have us to come and babble at you.
Right on.
So until next time, thank you, John.
Right on. Thank you, sir. This was fun.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.